The invitation arrived on a Tuesday, sealed in wax the color of dried blood, and by Thursday the entire Ashworth household had rearranged itself around a single sentence written in the Duke of Thornefield's own hand. He requested the company of Mrs. Ashworth and her daughters at his estate for the remainder of the season, that his mother, the Dowager Duchess, might have the comfort of female society during her long convalescence. Mrs. Ashworth read the letter 3 times at the breakfast table, and on the third reading her eyes lifted to her elder daughter Camilla, with an expression so naked in its hope that even the housemaid clearing the toast rack looked away. Nobody looked at Wren at all. She sat at the far end of the table, buttering her bread in the unhurried way of a girl who had long ago stopped expecting to be addressed first, or second, or at all, and she watched her mother's face perform its small arithmetic. The Duke was 31, unmarried, said to be handsome in the grave, unsmiling way of men who have buried more than they have loved, and he was, above every other fact that mattered in a Somerset drawing-room, a duke. Camilla's hair was the color of ripe wheat, and her waist had been the subject of 3 separate poems written by 3 separate young men who had never once been asked to dinner again. If any daughter of the Ashworth line was going to walk into Thornefield and walk out a duchess, everyone at that table had already decided which daughter it would be, and no one had thought to ask Wren's opinion. Because no one asked Wren much of anything. She did not mind it as much as she once had. There is a kind of peace that settles over a person who has stopped competing for a prize she was never entered to win, and Wren had found hers early, at 19, folded into books and gardens and the small unglamorous kindnesses that nobody else wanted to perform. She was not unlovely. She had her father's steady grey eyes and a mouth that curved easily when something amused her, which was often, privately, but she had none of Camilla's blaze, and blaze was what the world seemed to want of a woman who hoped to be noticed. They arrived at Thornefield on a grey afternoon in early April, the carriage wheels churning up a fine mist of gravel dust as they came up the long avenue of lime trees, and the house itself rose out of the mist like something that had grown there rather than been built. Grey stone softened by centuries of rain, ivy climbing one whole wing, as though the earth was slowly reclaiming what men had borrowed from it. Camilla pressed her gloved hand to the window and made a small sound of pure delight. Wren pressed nothing. She only looked and felt, in some wordless region of herself, that the house was tired the way a person is tired, not a building, and she thought that was a strange thing to feel about stone and mortar, and said nothing of it to anyone. They were received in the long gallery by the housekeeper, a narrow, handsome woman named Mrs. Calliver, whose eyes moved over the 3 Ashworth women with the swift, assessing look of someone counting silver. The Duke himself, they were informed, was occupied with estate business, and would join them at dinner. The Dowager Duchess was resting, and would receive them on the morrow. And so the first hours at Thornefield passed in the particular limbo of guests who have been placed somewhere lovely, and told, gently, to wait. It was Wren who could not simply wait. She had never learned the art of sitting decoratively in a drawing-room with her hands folded, and by the second afternoon, while her mother catalogued the value of the drapery, and Camilla practiced entering rooms in 3 different ways before the long mirror, Wren had wandered out through a side door into the gardens, drawn by nothing more than the sight of a walled enclosure gone half to ruin, roses climbing wild and untended over a stone bench, and an old man on his knees in the dirt, swearing softly at a hedge. "You'll want the shears from the potting shed for that," she said, before she had quite decided to speak at all. "Pulling deadwood by hand only tears the living cane." The old man looked up, startled, and Wren realized too late that she had spoken to him as though she had some right to be advising the gardening of a duke's estate. But he only squinted at her, taking her measure, and something in his weathered face eased. "You know roses, miss?" "I know neglect," she said, and surprised herself with the honesty of it. This garden has been left to itself a long while. Since the old Duke died, the gardener said, straightening slowly, one hand pressed to the small of his back. Her Grace used to walk here every morning with him. Hasn't set foot in it since. Not properly. Says it's too much bother now, with her hip. I say it's grief wearing a hip's clothing, but nobody asks old Thomas his opinion. He looked at her sideways. You're not one to sit still indoors, are you? I have never been very good at it, Wren admitted. That evening at dinner, Wren discovered that the Duke of Thornefield was every bit as unsmiling as reputation had promised. He was a tall man, dark-haired, with a stillness about him that was not quite coldness, but something adjacent to it. A watchfulness, as though he had trained himself long ago to give away nothing at a table full of people who wanted things from him. He greeted Mrs. Ashworth with correct courtesy, and Camilla with the faintest, most practiced warmth. The warmth of a man performing a duty he had performed 100 times before, with 100 other hopeful young women arranged across 100 other tables. And when his eyes reached Wren at the end of the row, they passed over her the way one's eyes pass over furniture. She was, in every sense that mattered to the room, invisible. She found she did not mind this either. It left her free to watch him, and what she watched was a man who ate methodically and said little, and answered Camilla's determined conversational sallies with the exact minimum courtesy required, and who, twice during the meal, glanced toward the window as though his mind were somewhere else entirely, in the garden perhaps, or further back than that, in some room of memory none of them had been invited into. It was 3 days before Wren was formally presented to the Dowager Duchess, and the meeting did not happen in the manner anyone had planned. She had gone out early, before the household stirred, because sleep had eluded her and the garden had become, in only a handful of days, the one place at Thornefield where she felt she was not performing a role written by someone else. She found the Duchess already there, a small, silver-haired woman wrapped in a shawl the color of ash, seated with visible difficulty on the very bench Wren had noticed on her first afternoon, her hands folded over a cane. Staring at the ruined roses with an expression of such private sorrow that Wren nearly turned back rather than intrude upon it. But the Duchess had already seen her. "You're the quiet one," the older woman said, without preamble, in a voice thinned by age, but not by weakness. "The one who doesn't chatter. I am told I chatter plenty, Your Grace, when there is something worth saying." Something flickered at the corner of the Duchess's mouth. "Sit, then, and tell me something worth saying. Or don't, and simply sit. I find I no longer have patience for people who feel obliged to fill silence." Wren sat. For a long while neither of them spoke, and the garden settled around them, birdsong and the distant clink of the kitchen waking, and it was, Wren thought, the first entirely comfortable silence she had shared with anyone since arriving at Thornefield. "My husband planted that rose," the Duchess said at last, nodding toward the wildest of the climbing canes, "the year our son was born. He used to say a garden left alone finds its own way given time, but I think he was wrong. I think a garden left alone simply forgets what it was for." She turned her pale eyes on Wren. "What is your name, child?" "Wren, Your Grace. Wren Ashworth." "Wren." The Duchess repeated it as though testing its weight. A small bird, easily overlooked, and yet wrens sing louder than birds twice their size. Did you know that? Disproportionately loud, for something so small. She studied Wren a moment longer. "I think I should like you to come and sit with me tomorrow, Miss Wren Ashworth. I find I have had quite enough this week of young women who chatter." And so it began. Not with a ballroom, not with a dance, not with the Duke's eye caught across a crowded room, but with an old woman's grief and a ruined garden, and a girl who had never learned to make herself smaller for anyone's comfort. Sitting together in the early light while, 3 floors above them, Camilla practiced her entrances before a mirror that could not tell her the truth she needed to hear. The days that followed folded into a rhythm nobody at Thornefield had planned, and nobody, least of all Wren, had expected to enjoy so much. Each morning she rose before the rest of the house, and found the Duchess already in the garden, or waiting to be helped into it, and each morning the old woman tested her a little further, with silences, with sharp questions, with small unkindnesses that Wren came to understand were not cruelty but armor, the particular defensiveness of someone who had been flattered by strangers for 40 years, and had grown to distrust anyone too eager to please her. Wren did not flatter her. She disagreed when she thought the Duchess wrong, which was rare but not never, and she said plainly when she did not know an answer, and once, when the Duchess remarked with brittle carelessness that she supposed she was only a burden now, taking up rooms and requiring patience nobody truly had to spare. Wren had set down the basket of cut stems in her lap and said, quite firmly, that grief was not the same as being a burden, and that anyone who confused the two had never properly grieved anything themselves. The Duchess had gone very still at that. For a moment, Wren feared she had overstepped in some unforgivable way, the way a poor relation might overstep by forgetting, even briefly, that she was a guest and not a confidante. But then the old woman's eyes had filled, and she had reached out one thin, ringed hand and pressed it briefly over Wren's, and said nothing at all, which said everything. It was Mrs. Culliver who first noticed how much time the youngest Ashworth daughter spent below stairs and in the gardens, in the company of servants and gardeners, and, increasingly, of her Grace, and it was Mrs. Culliver who first mentioned it, lightly, almost kindly, in the manner of someone merely making an observation, to Mrs. Ashworth over the household accounts one afternoon. "Your younger daughter has quite a talent for making herself useful," the housekeeper said, in a tone that somehow made usefulness sound very close to civility. "One might almost mistake her for one of the staff, the way she goes about the place." Mrs. Ashworth's face had tightened at that, in the particular way it did whenever anything threatened the delicate architecture of her plans, and that evening she had drawn Wren aside, with a grip on her wrist a shade too firm to be affectionate. "You are not here to play companion to an old woman in a garden," she said, low and urgent. "You are here because your sister requires every advantage this house can offer her, and it does your sister no advantage at all for people to see you scrambling about in the dirt like a scullery maid. Do you understand me? The Duke has scarcely looked at you, which is precisely as it should be. See that it remains so." Wren had said nothing in reply, because there was nothing to say that her mother would have heard. But she had gone to bed that night with her wrist aching faintly where the fingers had gripped it, and had thought, not for the first time, that there were entire rooms of herself her mother had simply never troubled to enter. She did not stop going to the garden. She could not have explained this, even to herself, except that the Duchess had begun to depend on her in ways too gentle and too gradual to name. A cushion adjusted before she asked for it, a shawl brought without being sent for, a silence held at precisely the moment silence was wanted rather than words, and Wren had discovered, somewhere in the small accumulating hours of those mornings, that being needed by someone honestly was worth more to her than being admired by a room full of strangers ever could be. The Duke noticed her first not in the garden, but through a door he had not meant to open. He had come looking for his mother one wet afternoon, later than her usual hour, and had found the small sitting room off the conservatory empty of the Duchess, but not of sound. A low, steady voice reading aloud, unhurried, patient, pausing now and then to explain a word or a reference the Duchess did not know, and he had stood in the doorway a long moment before either woman noticed him, simply listening, because it had been years. He realized with a small, unwelcome jolt, since he had heard anyone read to his mother without performing the reading for his benefit. It was the youngest Ashworth girl, the quiet one. He had absorbed her presence at his table each evening, the way one absorbs a competently arranged flower, noted, appreciated in the vaguest sense, promptly forgotten, and he found himself faintly astonished to discover she possessed a voice at all, let alone one his mother listened to, with her eyes closed and her hands, for the first time in longer than he cared to count, entirely unclenched in her lap. Gerard, his mother's eyes opened at his step, and something in her face, a softness he had not seen there since his father's funeral, closed itself off again, replaced by the brisker mask she wore for him. "You've come at last. I didn't mean to interrupt." "You didn't." The Duchess glanced at Wren, who had risen and was already moving toward the door with the unobtrusive efficiency of someone accustomed to making herself scarce. "Miss Ashworth was reading to me. She does it very well. Better than the nurse, who mumbles, and infinitely better than you, who never has the patience." Wren, halfway to the door, felt her face heat, and did not know whether it was her own name spoken so directly by the Duke's mother, or the sudden unwelcome awareness of his eyes actually resting on her, properly resting, for what she realized was the first time since her arrival. That caused the warmth. She dropped a small, correct curtsy and excused herself before either of them could say more, and did not see. Because she had already turned away, the frown of genuine curiosity that had settled between the Duke's dark brows as he watched her go. He found himself, in the days that followed, arranging his own hours around hers, without entirely admitting that he was doing so. He would find some pretext to pass through the conservatory at the hour he had learned, without meaning to learn it, that she generally sat there with his mother. He noticed things he had no business noticing, that she wore the same 2 grey dresses in rotation, carefully mended at the cuff, while her sister appeared each evening in some new confection, clearly acquired for this very visit, that she took her tea without sugar, and gave whatever was offered to the dogs, who had taken to following her about the grounds with the devoted stupidity of animals who know precisely who will slip them bread under the table, that she never once, in all the evenings he had watched her across his own dinner table, attempted to draw his attention toward herself, not with a glance, not with a laugh pitched a fraction too loud, not with any of the small choreographed maneuvers he had grown so weary of enduring from other women in other seasons. It should not have interested him. He told himself this frequently, in the flat, disciplined tone he used for estate ledgers and difficult tenants, a tone that had served him well since he was 26 and had inherited a title, a debt, and a grief he had never properly finished carrying. He had a duty this season, plainly understood by every party involved, though never once stated aloud at dinner, to marry, to secure the line, to choose sensibly from among the women his mother's failing health and his own exhausted heart had no real energy left to resist. Camilla Ashworth was lovely and biddable, and would, by every practical measure available to him, make a perfectly adequate duchess. And yet it was her sister's steady grey eyes he found himself thinking of, unbidden, at the oddest hours, while reviewing tenant accounts, while riding the eastern boundary alone in the rain, while lying awake in the vast cold architecture of a bed built for a marriage he had not yet made. The turn came, as such turns often do, not through any grand gesture, but through a small crisis nobody had thought to prepare for. It was the 3rd week of the Ashworths' visit, when the Duchess, descending the garden steps against Wren's careful advice, missed her footing on stone still damp from morning rain, and went down hard, her cane skittering away across the gravel, a cry torn from her that brought half the household running. Wren reached her first, had in fact been at her elbow the entire time, trying and failing to persuade her to wait for the drier hour of noon. And it was Wren's steady hands that found the injury was the wrist, and not, thank God, the hip everyone had dreaded. Wren's calm voice that kept the old woman from panicking while gardeners and footmen converged in a confused clatter of alarm. Wren, who thought, in the chaos, to send a boy running for the physician in the village, rather than waiting for someone in the house to think of it first. The Duke arrived at a dead run from the stables, still in his riding clothes, and found his mother sitting upright against Wren's shoulder in the wet grass, pale but lucid, her wrist already bound with what he recognized, on closer inspection, as a strip torn from the hem of Wren's own petticoat. She wouldn't wait for the doctor to bind it properly, the Duchess said, faintly amused despite her obvious pain. Before he could speak. Set an unset wrist left loose does worse harm than a wrist bound wrong, and that she'd rather be scolded for improvising than watch me suffer for propriety's sake. I find I rather admire her nerve. He looked at Wren then, really looked, the way he had been careful, for 3 weeks, not to look, not directly, not long enough for anyone to remark upon it, and saw a young woman kneeling in wet grass with mud on him and his mother's blood, faint but present, on her sleeve, her face tight with worry that had nothing whatever to do with how the scene might appear to him, and something in his chest, some old locked door he had not opened in a very long time, shifted a fraction on its hinge. "Thank you," he said, and the words came out rougher than he intended, thick with an emotion he had not planned to feel. "I did very little, Your Grace," Wren said, already rising, already retreating a step, as though his gratitude were a spotlight she meant to slip out from under as quickly as possible. "Your mother is the brave one. She scarcely made a sound. She never does," he said, and for the first time since her arrival, he smiled briefly, involuntarily, gone almost before it had fully formed, and Wren, seeing it, felt something in her own chest answer it, quietly, before she had the sense to stop it. The Duchess's recovery gave Wren a fortnight of quiet, uncontested purpose, and it was during that fortnight that the garden itself began. Slowly, to change. It began almost by accident, Wren asking old Thomas one morning whether the wild rose might be saved rather than simply hacked back, and Thomas, delighted to have anyone ask him anything at all, showing her how to prune for new growth rather than mere tidiness. And it grew from there into something neither of them had precisely planned. An hour here, an hour there, borrowed from her mornings with the Duchess, and given instead to coaxing the ruined garden back toward the shape it must once have held, when a young duke and his new wife walked it together each morning, before either of them had learned what grief was. She did not think of it as significant. She thought of it, if she thought of it at all in words, as simply a kindness owed to an old woman who could no longer kneel in the dirt herself, but who could, on fine afternoons now, be wheeled to the garden's edge in a chair, and watch the roses slowly reclaim their shape, and weep, sometimes, quietly, without needing to explain why, because Wren never asked her to. It was in that same fortnight that Thornefield held its first proper gathering of the season. A modest ball assembled at the Duchess's insistence now that her wrist had mended enough to permit her to sit up through an evening of music, and it was there, in front of nearly 40 guests, drawn from the county's better families, that the sentence which had begun this whole strange season was finally spoken aloud rather than merely implied. Mrs. Ashworth had spent the better part of a week preparing Camilla for that evening, with the single-minded devotion of a general preparing an army for its one decisive battle. A new gown ordered specially from Bath, her hair dressed by a woman brought in at considerable and unaffordable expense, every word she might say to the Duke rehearsed until it had lost, Wren privately thought, watching her sister practice her laugh before the glass for the 4th time that afternoon, whatever charm it might once have possessed. Wren herself wore the better of her 2 grey dresses, freshly pressed, with a spray of the garden's own roses pinned at her collar, because she had nothing finer to offer the evening, and had long since stopped pretending otherwise. The ball unfolded exactly as such evenings generally did, music and candlelight, and the low continuous murmur of a county assessing itself, until an older gentleman, a family friend of the Ashworths' distant acquaintance, remarked rather too loudly near the refreshment table that surely the Duke meant to open the dancing with one of his young guests, and wasn't it plain enough which one he ought to choose, gesturing with his glass toward Camilla, radiant in candlelight at the center of an admiring circle. The Duke, drawn into the conversation by simple proximity, found himself cornered by the old gentleman's bluff, well-meaning insistence into a question he had not meant to ask aloud at all. "Mrs. Ashworth tells me she has brought both her daughters to us this season," he said, with the careful courtesy of a man attempting to extract himself from an awkward moment without giving offense. "I confess I have not yet had the pleasure of dancing with either. Perhaps," and here, pressed by the old gentleman's expectant smile and by his own mother's watchful eye across the room, he said the words that would echo through the household gossip for weeks afterward. "Perhaps Mrs. Ashworth would be good enough to bring forward the prettiest of her daughters, that I might open the dancing properly." He meant nothing cruel by it, meant, in truth, almost nothing at all, the sort of empty pleasantry a man says when cornered into performing an interest he does not genuinely feel. But the words travelled faster than any correction could follow them. And Mrs. Ashworth, hearing them relayed within the minute, by no fewer than 3 delighted witnesses, seized upon them with an eagerness that bordered on triumph. She had Camilla across the room and curtsying before the Duke within moments, her face alight with a vindication 4 years in the planning, and the Duke, bound now by the plain unavoidable logic of his own careless words, could do nothing but offer his arm and lead her onto the floor. Wren, watching from the edge of the room with a glass of lemonade she had no particular wish to drink, felt the sentence land in her chest with a weight entirely disproportionate to its actual cruelty. He had not asked for her. Of course, he had not asked for her. She had never once imagined. Whatever small private warmth had grown between them in a garden full of roses, that she was the sister anyone would think to call forward at a ball. And yet hearing the plain fact of it spoken aloud, in front of 40 witnesses, in words that placed her so precisely and so publicly outside the boundary of what the evening was for, struck harder than she had braced herself to receive it. "He did not mean you any insult," said a voice at her elbow, and she turned to find old Thomas's granddaughter, a housemaid named Prudence, who had grown fond of her over the weeks of garden work, offering the observation with the blunt kindness of someone who had spent the evening watching from the same unglamorous margin Wren now occupied. "Gentlemen say a great many foolish things when they're cornered by an old fool with a glass of punch. You mark me, miss, he's looked toward this corner of the room 3 times already since he led your sister out, and not once toward the lady in his own arms." Wren did not allow herself the comfort of believing this fully, though she noticed, despite herself, that it was true, that across the length of a crowded floor, in the brief unguarded moments between the figures of the dance, the Duke's eyes did indeed drift, again and again, toward the corner where she stood, and that each time they did, something in his careful, composed face seemed to falter very slightly, as though he too had heard the echo of his own careless sentence, and did not much care for the shape it had taken. He found her an hour later, when the dancing had loosened into general conversation, and the crush of guests had thinned enough to permit a private word, standing near the tall windows that looked out over the dark garden. "I said something foolish tonight," he said, without preamble, "and I think you heard it, and I would rather you heard the truth from me directly than carry the wrong meaning of it home in your own thoughts. You need not explain yourself to me, Your Grace. You asked for the prettiest of Mrs. Ashworth's daughters, and Mrs. Ashworth was only too glad to oblige you. There is no mystery in it, and no offence taken that requires correcting." "There is offence," he said, "if you believe for even a moment that I meant it the way it was received. I was cornered by an old fool's insistence, and answered without thought, the way a man answers a question he has not troubled to consider seriously, and I have thought of little else since, but how thoroughly I regretted the words the instant they left me. I do not know your sister well enough yet to judge her prettiness against anyone's, and I find, the longer this season runs, that I have grown considerably less interested in judging any woman by so shallow a measure at all." He paused, and something in his voice roughened, the same unguarded roughness she had heard once before, briefly, in the wet grass beside his fallen mother. "I would rather know a woman by whether she tells the truth to an old man's face, or binds a wound with her own petticoat rather than wait for propriety, or reads to a lonely woman in a voice that makes her weep with something other than grief. I find those measures interest me a great deal more than prettiness, Miss Ashworth, and I think you know precisely which sister that description more truly fits." Wren said nothing for a long moment, watching the dark garden beyond the glass, the roses she had spent a fortnight coaxing back to life invisible now beneath the night, but present all the same, patient, rooted, waiting for morning. "You should be careful, Your Grace," she said finally, "of saying such things to a woman who has spent her whole life being told plainly which sister the room prefers. I have made a fragile sort of peace with that arrangement. I would rather not have it disturbed by kindness I cannot afford to mistake for something more lasting." "And if it is meant to be lasting?" he asked, quietly, and did not wait for an answer he could see. In the sudden stillness of her face, she was not yet prepared to give, before the crowd behind them shifted and drew his attention away, and the moment folded itself closed, unfinished, to wait for another evening. The Duke found himself watching this transformation with an attention he could no longer pretend was purely filial concern for his mother's comfort. He took to walking the garden's perimeter in the evenings, ostensibly for exercise, and found that his path bent, more often than chance alone could explain, toward whichever corner Wren happened to be working in, her sleeves pushed back, her hair coming loose from its pins, utterly unconscious of being watched, utterly unlike anyone else who had ever moved through his house. "You've done what 3 gardeners and considerable expense failed to do in a decade," he said to her one evening, coming upon her unstaking a climbing rose with more determination than technique. Wren startled, nearly dropping the twine, and turned to find him closer than she had realized, his coat off, his sleeves rolled in the informal way he never appeared before company, watching her with an expression she could not read, and did not trust herself to try reading too closely. "Thomas did the real work, Your Grace. I only kept him company, and occasionally handed him the wrong tool. My mother tells a different story. Your mother is generous. My mother," the Duke said, "has not once in 10 years been accused of excessive generosity. Ask anyone who has served on my household staff." A ghost of that rare smile again. "She likes you a great deal, Miss Ashworth. It is not a small thing to be liked by her. I confess I am beginning to understand why." Wren's hands had gone still on the twine. She did not look at him, because she did not entirely trust her own face not to give away something she had not yet given herself permission to feel, and the silence that followed was not uncomfortable so much as charged, full of something neither of them was prepared to name. "You should go in," he said finally, gently, nodding toward the darkening sky. "It will rain again before long." "Yes," she said, and did not move for a moment longer than was strictly necessary, and neither, she noticed, did he. It could not last, of course, that quiet, unremarked-upon happiness, precisely because it was unremarked upon by no one but themselves. Mrs. Colliver had eyes in every corridor of Thornefield, and what those eyes reported to her, the Duke's evening walks bent consistently toward the garden. His increasing silence at dinner, where once he had at least performed courtesy toward Camilla, the low murmur of conversation overheard once, twice, 3 times between himself and the younger, plainer, poorer Ashworth daughter, troubled her far more than she let show. Mrs. Colliver had served Thornefield for 2 decades, and had watched, across those years, a great many ambitious mothers parade a great many daughters through these halls, and she had formed, In that time, very fixed ideas about what sort of woman belonged in a duchess's chair. And a penniless girl who spent her mornings with her hands in the dirt was not among them. Nor, though she would not have admitted the full shape of it even to herself, could Mrs. Colliver forget that it was she who had recommended, years before, the housekeeper's post at Thornefield to her own niece, a post that would fall vacant, and rather advantageously so. Should the new Duchess prove someone easily managed, rather than someone, God forbid, who noticed things, who asked questions of accounts, who might one day look too closely at the small private economies Mrs. Colliver had arranged for herself, across 20 patient years of skimming here and adjusting there. Mrs. Ashworth needed no such elaborate motive. She needed only the plain cold fear of watching her carefully laid plans dissolve in front of her. And it was Mrs. Ashworth who first cornered Wren in the privacy of their shared dressing-room and demanded, in a voice sharpened to a blade, exactly what she thought she was doing, walking with the Duke unchaperoned, monopolizing his mother's every waking hour, making a spectacle of herself in the dirt like some common gardener's girl, while her own sister's prospects withered on the vine beside her. "I have done nothing but sit with an old woman who is lonely," Wren said, "and tend a garden that needed tending. If the Duke has chosen, of his own will, to walk there in the evenings, I can hardly be blamed for the path he takes on his own land." "You will be blamed," her mother said, "for whatever it is convenient for people to blame you for, and you will find that a duke's regard, once it settles somewhere inconvenient, causes considerably more difficulty for the girl beneath him than for the man himself. Stop this, for your sister's sake, if not your own. You have never once, in your whole life, been the one who was chosen, Wren, and I would spare you the particular cruelty of believing, even briefly, that you might be now." It was not said unkindly. Precisely, it was said. Wren understood even as it struck her like a slap, out of a fear so old and so deeply worn into her mother's understanding of the world that it had calcified into something indistinguishable from cruelty, though it had perhaps begun, decades before, as something closer to grief. But it struck all the same, and struck true in the place Wren had spent years carefully armoring against exactly this, the old familiar conviction that she was not the daughter meant for admiration, not the daughter meant for choosing, only the daughter meant for usefulness, for service, for standing quietly in the margins while the story happened to someone else. She did not sleep well that night. She told herself, staring at the canopy of an unfamiliar bed in a house that was not hers and never would be, that her mother was, in the coldest arithmetic of the world as it actually operated, entirely correct. Dukes did not marry poor relations who mended their own hems. Dukes married Camillus. And whatever strange, warm, dangerous thing had begun to grow in the garden between herself and a grieving, guarded man who had smiled at her exactly twice in 3 weeks, was, in the end, likely to cost her far more than it could ever give her. The theft was discovered 4 days later, and it was discovered, with a precision that Wren would only later understand had been no accident at all, in a manner that pointed every finger in the household directly at her. It was a brooch, sapphire, set in old gold, a piece the Duchess had worn on her wedding day and treasured beyond its considerable monetary value for reasons that had nothing to do with money, and it went missing from the Duchess's dressing table on an afternoon when, as it happened, Wren had been the last person seen entering that room, carrying in a fresh vase of garden roses as she did most afternoons, alone, unaccompanied, for perhaps 10 unwitnessed minutes. Mrs. Colliver raised the alarm with an efficiency that left no room for quiet inquiry. By supper-time the whole household knew a valuable piece of the Duchess's jewellery had vanished. By the following morning, through channels Wren could never afterward fully trace but suspected, with a bitterness she was ashamed of, led back to a housekeeper's careful whispers and a mother's careless, frightened repetition of those whispers to anyone who would listen. It was widely understood below stairs, and increasingly above them, that the poor Ashworth girl, the one who spent so much unsupervised time in the family's private rooms, who had, after all, arrived with nothing, and might reasonably be expected to leave with something, was the likeliest hand behind it. Wren denied it, of course, with a steadiness that surprised even herself, given how thoroughly the ground beneath her had just given way. She had not touched the brooch. She had not been anywhere near the Duchess's dressing table beyond the 10 minutes required to set down a vase of flowers and adjust the drapery, as she did every day, as a dozen witnesses could presumably attest to on any other afternoon when nothing had gone wrong. But denial, she discovered, carries very little weight against a story that everyone in a room has already half decided to believe, particularly when the alternative, that a trusted decades-long housekeeper or a desperate, socially cornered mother might have some hand in the matter, was so much less convenient to consider. The Duchess, to her enormous credit, refused outright to believe it, and said so sharply to anyone who would listen, her bandaged wrist notwithstanding. But the Duchess was recovering from a fall, and could not be everywhere, could not personally search every room and question every servant, and it was the Duke, summoned back from a fortnight's necessary business in London, the very evening the theft was discovered, arriving home to a household in an uproar he had not anticipated, who was left to decide. In the space of a single terrible interview conducted in his study with his mother's steward and Mrs. Colliver both present and both, in their different ways, urging the same conclusion, what was to be done? He looked at Wren across that study, pale, exhausted, her chin lifted in a manner that struck him, even in the wreckage of the moment, as more dignity than he had seen from anyone else in that room combined, and he wanted, with a force that frightened him slightly, simply to believe her. But he had inherited, along with his title, a decade of careful lessons in the ruthless management of appearances, and a household in uproar over a missing family heirloom, with witnesses prepared to swear to opportunity if not to guilt, was not a situation a duke could resolve on the strength of a feeling. "I do not believe you took it," he said to her, quietly, when the others had at last withdrawn, and they stood alone in the lamplit study, the fire guttering low. "I want you to understand that clearly, before anything else is said tonight." "But you cannot say so plainly, in front of the household," Wren finished for him, when he seemed unable to complete the thought himself, "because to do so would mean accusing someone else, and you have no proof of that either, and a duke's word without proof, spoken against his own housekeeper's testimony, would create a scandal of its own kind." She drew a breath that trembled only slightly. "I understand the position you are in, Your Grace. I do not think you cruel. I think you are careful, and caution is not the same thing as cruelty. But I cannot stay in a house where I am suspected, whatever the private feelings of its master." Wren, it was the first time he had used her given name, and it seemed to startle them both. "Give me time, a few days only, to find the truth of this properly, without the whole house watching. I will not let this stand against you." And in those days, she said, "What am I to do? Sit at your table beneath the eyes of every servant and guest who now believes me a thief, and smile, and pass the salt, and wait for your investigation to conclude at its own leisure? I have some pride left, Your Grace, whatever else I may have lost this week. I would rather leave with my name in question than stay and watch it be slowly, politely destroyed in front of me." She left Thornefield 2 mornings later, in the grey, unceremonious light of an ordinary departure. Her mother tight-lipped with a shame that curdled, as shame so often does, into anger directed entirely at the wrong person. Her sister silent and pale and unable, even now, to look directly at her. The Duke was not there to see her go. He had ridden out before dawn on estate business he could not in the end postpone, and Wren told herself, climbing into the hired carriage that would carry her home to a modest house and a diminished future, that it was better this way. Better not to have to watch his face while she left. Better not to have to wonder, for the rest of a long and probably unremarkable life, whether what she had seen in it these past weeks had ever truly been what she believed it was. The house at Thornefield, in the weeks that followed her departure, became a stranger to itself. The Duke noticed it first in his mother, whose recovery, so steady and hopeful through April, seemed suddenly to stall, then reverse, the Duchess taking her meals in her room again. Refusing the garden even on fine days, the light gone out of conversations that had, for one brief unlikely season, sparkled with something like her old wit. He noticed it in the garden itself, which without Wren's daily attention began, within a fortnight, to show the first signs of the neglect it had so recently been rescued from. Roses left unstaked, weeds creeping back along the border, old Thomas working alone and grumbling that nobody these days had the patience for a proper prune. He noticed it, most of all, in himself, in the silence of his own evenings, in the walks he no longer had any reason to take toward the garden's far corner, in the strange hollow persistence of a name he found himself thinking on at every quiet hour of the day, and could not, however he tried, dislodge. It was his mother who finally said aloud what he had not permitted himself to say. "You have let the best thing that has happened to this house in a decade walk out of it," the Duchess said to him one evening, with the particular bluntness age and grief had long since burned away all patience for softening. "Because you were afraid of what your housekeeper and that wretched, ambitious mother might whisper about you. And I confess, Gerard, I raised you to be a great many things, but I did not raise you to be a coward." "I am not a coward," he said, stung. "I am careful. You are afraid," the Duchess said, "and it wears the costume of caution so well that even you have been fooled by it. That girl bound my wrist in the wet grass with a strip of her own petticoat, rather than wait for propriety to catch up with an emergency, and you cannot even find the courage to defend her name against a housekeeper's gossip. Find the truth, Gerard. You are the Duke of Thornefield. If you cannot uncover the theft of one brooch in your own house, in your own time, with every resource a title like yours commands, then you have learned nothing at all from the running of this estate these 10 years. And I have wasted a great deal of worry on a son I overestimated. It was not, in the end, difficult to find. Once he applied to the task the same disciplined attention he had spent a decade applying to tenant disputes and estate accounts, and every other problem he had ever permitted himself to take seriously. A quiet word with the under-housemaid who cleaned the Duchess's rooms, frightened into honesty by the private assurance that no blame would fall on her for speaking. A discreet inquiry to a jeweler in the nearest town, made under an assumed pretext, that turned up a sapphire brooch of old gold pawned some 10 days earlier by a woman answering, in every particular, to Mrs. Culliver's description, a final quiet confrontation in his study that ended, within the half-hour, in a full and weeping confession. The debts accumulated over years of careful private theft finally too large to conceal. The convenient opportunity of a suspected outsider too tempting to resist. The niece's advancement too long and patiently planned to risk losing to a stranger's steady grey eyes. And an old woman's growing affection. Mrs. Culliver was dismissed from Thornefield within the hour. Her decades of service ended not in the comfortable pension she might once have expected, but in the plain, unadorned disgrace her own choices had earned her. And the Duke of Thornefield, for the first time in longer than he could remember acting on impulse rather than calculation, called for his fastest horse and rode out that same evening, in the last grey light of a long spring day, toward a modest house some 3 hours distant that he had never seen, and knew only by the directions scrawled hastily on an old letter. He arrived at the Ashworth house well after dark, travel-stained and unannounced, and it was Mrs. Ashworth herself who opened the door to him, her face draining of colour at the sight of a duke standing unattended on her doorstep at so unlikely an hour, already stammering apologies and explanations before he had said a single word. "I have not come to accept an apology," he said, with a quiet authority that silenced her mid-sentence. "I have come to correct a wrong that should never have been permitted to happen, and I would be glad, madam, if you would allow me to speak with your daughter." Wren came down the narrow stair in the plain grey dress she had worn nearly every day of the visit that had upended her life, her hair loosely pinned, clearly unprepared for company of any kind, and stopped dead at the sight of him standing in her mother's small, shabby parlour, filling it somehow with a presence far too large for the room. "Your Grace." Her voice was careful, guarded, the voice of someone bracing for one more disappointment in a season that had delivered a great many. "I did not expect Mrs. Colliver has confessed," he said, before she could retreat further behind that careful voice. The bruik was hers, pawned to cover debts she had been concealing for years. "You were never guilty of anything, Miss Ashworth, beyond the crime of being kinder and more honest than anyone else in my household had troubled to be in a very long time. And I have come to say so plainly, in front of your family, so that no shadow of doubt follows you home from a house that failed you." The relief that broke across Wren's face was so immediate, so unguarded, that he felt something in his own chest loosen in answer to it. But it was followed, within a breath, by something more complicated. A wariness that had not been there before, 3 weeks ago, in a garden full of roses. "Thank you for coming to tell me," she said. "You did not need to ride 3 hours in the dark to do it. A letter would have served." "A letter," he said, "would not have permitted me to say the rest of what I came to say." Her mother, sensing the shape of a conversation she suddenly, urgently wished to be present for, made a small movement toward remaining in the room. The Duke, without raising his voice, without so much as looking directly at her, said, "If you would permit us a few moments, madam," in a tone that brooked no negotiation, and Mrs. Ashworth, to her own visible astonishment, found herself retreating up the stairs. "I do not think," Wren said, when they were alone, "that there is anything left to say, Your Grace, that would change what has already happened. I have been accused, publicly, in front of a household that will remember the accusation far longer than it remembers the confession that cleared it. I cannot simply return to Thornefield, as though nothing occurred, to sit at your table and be looked at by servants who spent a fortnight believing me a thief. I do not want you to return to Thornefield to sit at my table," he said, and something in his voice, a roughness, an urgency entirely unlike the controlled courtesy she had known from him across 3 weeks of dinners, made her look up sharply. "I want you to return to Thornefield as its mistress, Miss Ashworth, if you will have me. And I want the household that wronged you to watch me choose you, openly, with every witness present who ever doubted you, so that no one beneath my roof is ever again permitted to imagine you are less than the best thing that house has known in a decade. I am not offering you a quiet reconciliation, done privately and forgotten by morning. I am asking you to marry me, publicly and unmistakably, and I will not pretend the asking is anything less than the truest thing I have felt in 10 years, of very carefully feeling nothing at all." Wren stood very still. Somewhere above them she could hear the faint, unmistakable creak of her mother and sister failing entirely to eavesdrop discreetly from the landing. And somewhere further off, in memory she could hear an old woman in a garden telling her that wrens sing louder than birds twice their size, disproportionately loud, for something so small, and she found when she finally spoke that her voice did not shake at all. "I did not come to Thornefield hoping to be chosen, Your Grace. I came prepared to be useful, and overlooked, and I had made my peace with that a long while before your letter ever reached my mother's table. I would not have you marry me out of guilt for what your housekeeper did, or out of some debt you imagine you owe me for a wrist bound in wet grass." "I am not marrying you out of guilt," he said, I am marrying you because my mother has not laughed freely in 10 years until you sat beside her in that garden. Because I have watched a dozen women perform warmth at my table and felt nothing, and watched you offer it without performance to everyone from my mother to my gardener to a housemaid nobody else troubles to learn the name of, and felt, for the first time since I was a very young man, that I might actually want to come home in the evenings rather than simply endure arriving there. I am not choosing you despite what you are, Miss Ashworth. I am choosing you entirely because of it, and I would be a poor sort of duke, and a poorer sort of man, if I let one housekeeper's cruelty cost me the only honest thing that has happened in that house since my father died. It was not, when she thought of it afterward in all the long contented years that followed, a proposal she had ever imagined for herself, not delivered in a ballroom, not accompanied by ring or rehearsed speech, but given plainly, urgently, imperfectly, by a man travel-stained and unannounced in her mother's shabby parlour, 3 hours from the house where he was master of everything except, until that moment, his own admission of what he wanted. But it was, she thought, exactly the proposal that suited them both, and when she said yes, quietly, without flourish, in the same steady voice she had used to tell an old gardener he wanted the shears rather than his bare hands, she meant it more completely than she had ever meant anything in a life spent. Until now, mostly unnoticed. They were married at Thornefield in early autumn, in a ceremony the Duchess insisted upon holding, against every fashionable convention, in the garden itself rather than the chapel, the roses, restored now to their full glory under 2 full seasons of patient tending, blooming riotously over the same stone bench where an old woman's grief had first opened, however cautiously, into friendship. Camilla stood among the small gathering of witnesses in a gown finer than the bride's, and found, to her own quiet surprise, that she felt no bitterness at all watching her sister married before her. Only something closer to shame at how completely their mother's arithmetic had failed to account for the one daughter who had never once been counted. Old Thomas gave Wren a spray of the wild rose to carry, cut that very morning from the cane her husband's father had planted the year his son was born. And the Duchess, seated in her chair at the garden's edge, with her recovered wrist folded neatly in her lap, wept without shame through the whole of the brief ceremony, and declared afterward, to anyone who would listen, that she had known from the very first quiet morning, from the very first honest silence a small grey-eyed girl had been willing to share with her, exactly how this story was going to end. Mrs. Ashworth, for her part, found the sudden reversal of her daughter's fortunes a difficult arithmetic to reconcile herself to, and it took the better part of a year before she could speak of Wren's marriage without a certain strained brightness that fooled no one, least of all Wren, who had long since stopped expecting her mother to fully understand a victory that had not come by the route she had planned for it. But the Duchess of Thornefield, for so Wren now was, however strange the title still felt in her own mouth on quiet mornings, bore her mother no lasting anger. She had spent too many years learning to forgive the world for overlooking her to spend her new happiness nursing old grievances, and when Mrs. Ashworth came at last, hesitant and unpractised, to offer something like an apology in the draughty little parlour, where a duke had once asked to marry her daughter, Wren had simply taken her mother's hands and told her that the past was a garden too, and could be tended into something bearable if one only had the patience for it. Camilla married 2 years later, not a duke, but a steady, kind-eyed baronet from the next county, who admired her without ever once asking her to be anything other than exactly what she was, and it was Camilla herself who confessed to Wren, on the eve of her own wedding, that she had spent that whole strange season at Thornefield secretly relieved, beneath all her mother's ambition, that the Duke's eyes had never truly settled on her, because she had watched, across 100 small, unremarked moments, the particular way he looked toward her sister in the garden, and had known, long before either Wren or the Duke had admitted it to themselves. Precisely which sister this story had always belonged to. The brooch, once recovered from the pawnbroker who had purchased it in good faith, was returned to the Duchess's dressing table, and there it stayed for a year and more before the old Duchess pressed it, quietly, into Wren's palm one autumn afternoon in the garden, closing her thin fingers over it with a firmness that brooked no refusal. "It was my wedding gift from a man who planted a rose the year our son was born," she said. "I should like it to belong now to the woman who taught that son how to walk back into his own garden again. Wear it, or don't, as you please, but let it be yours, freely given, so that no one in this house ever again mistakes it for something stolen rather than something earned." Wren wore it, in the end only rarely, at her own wedding, tucked at her collar beneath the spray of wild roses Thomas had cut for her. At the christening of her first daughter 3 years later, a small dark-eyed girl, the old Duchess declared, with unconcealed delight, had inherited her grandmother's own stubbornness and her mother's own steady grey eyes, and once more, many years after that, at the old Duchess's own quiet funeral, held on a soft grey morning in the very garden she had once refused to enter, surrounded by roses that had never, in all the years since, been permitted to run wild again. The house at Thornefield, in the years that followed Wren's marriage, never again fell quiet the way it had in that terrible fortnight of her absence. Word travelled, as it always does in a county fond of its own gossip, of how the young Duchess had come to Thornefield a poor relation overlooked at her own family's table, and left it mistress of one of the finest houses in the shire, chosen not for her beauty, but in spite of the world's indifference to it. And there were those among the county's ambitious mothers who found the story faintly alarming, a dangerous precedent for daughters everywhere to take too much comfort in, and there were others, quieter, less fashionable women who had spent their own lives standing at the edges of rooms, who heard it and felt something in their own chests loosen, just slightly, at the knowledge that a story like theirs could end this way too. The garden itself was never again permitted to run entirely wild, though it was allowed, at the new Duchess's insistence, its own measure of unruliness here and there. A climbing rose left to wander where it wished along the old stone wall, a bench left deliberately unrepaired, where the moss had grown soft and green across one corner, because some things, she had come to believe in her own quiet fashion, were better loved a little imperfect than pruned into a shape that suited everyone's expectations but their own. And on quiet mornings, when the mist still clung low along the lime avenue and the rest of the great house slept on, the Duke of Thornefield could still be found, more often than any steward or solicitor thought entirely proper for a man of his rank, kneeling in the dirt beside his wife, his sleeves pushed back, his hands as stained with earth as hers, learning at last, in the unhurried patience of her example, exactly what it meant to tend something faithfully enough that it finally, fully, and lastingly bloomed, not despite the years of neglect that had come before, but because someone had finally troubled to notice it was worth the tending at all,